Hi hobbyists, Brendan Roy here with Privateer Press. In our last series with Dallas, we got a great set of techniques under our belt for taking our battle group from packaged to painted. Starting with this video, I'm going to go over some new skills to add to your arsenal. The first technique we're going to look at is ice and frost effects. Let's get started. So I've already prepared a wet palette, as well as I have a selection of colors here, different blues, as well as Mara white. We'll be starting with frostbite, so I'm going to give it a good shake, and then I'm going to load it onto my wet palette. The wet palette's going to do good to keep it watered down for me as I apply my first initial base coats. So we're just going to get a little bit on the tip here. There we go. Then we're going to apply some. And this is going to take multiple thin coats, but that's okay. That's a little too thin. It's okay if you go over and get outside the lines, because you can always clean it up later pretty easily. Just make sure you get a good thin coat, which your wet palette helps you with. Going back to the wet palette, I'll be loading my brush some more and going over it a second time. Like I said, thin coats are definitely better than thick ones, even if you have to go over it multiple times. The base coat is the most important part. So without a proper application of a base coat, you can easily obscure your details. So thin paint is always better, and that's why you'll hear it come up often. People usually find base coating the most tedious and boring part of painting, but I like to think of it that once it's over, the fun gets to begin. Alright, at this point I've finished up the base coat, and I've went outside the lines a little bit, but since it's such a thin layer applied, it's okay, I can clean it up later, no problems when I do the axe head and the metal. Now that I've finished the base coat of frostbite, I'm going to move on to fine lines of Mara white. Putting a little bit on my wet palette. I'm going to add a little bit of water as well to make sure that it runs smoothly when I apply it to the model. This layer is going to highlight the frost and apply a good amount of contrast to the miniature. I'm applying fine lines that trace the outside edge of the ice. Now you could shade first, but I'm opting to do the shade afterwards so it ties the white into the frostbite and blends the lines together. Using my pinky, I'm going to brace it up against the model so I can get better accuracy with my brush tip. I'm going to make sure not to have too much Mara white cover up too much of the frostbite, because we'll be applying another shade level. And you want to still have frostbite, Mara white, and the shade visible for the contrast. One important thing about ice is how sharp the contrast can be. In this case, contrast is the relative difference between the light and dark areas on your miniature. You can create more contrast by painting your highlights brighter and your shadow areas darker. So on this axe, it's very important to make sure that the Mara white is bright, because the effect of ice will be achieved when it is contrasted with the dark shadow areas we will add in our later steps. So it might not look like there's too much contrast going on. It'll definitely show through once we get the glaze on. So now that we've finished the Mara white highlights, we're going to go on to a glaze of Meridius blue. So the thing about a glaze, it's a very extremely thin down paint. So we'll want to add extra water to make sure that it disperses correctly. So with my glaze made, I'm going to pick some up on my brush, just like you would any other layer. And I'm going to apply it into the shadows, as well as make sure I pull it up onto the other layers of the paint. We're looking to tint the entire surface of the ice, and it's very important that it does not pool. Glazing is a very good and useful technique when it comes to bringing multiple layers together. And when you do this, you usually want to work with brighter layers so the darker glaze can tie them all in. When using glazes, painting in higher and brighter colors works better for the end result of the glaze. So with the first layer of the glaze done, I'm going to apply another layer, but this is going to be more concentrated to where I think the shadows and the reflections will be in the ice. Glazing is different from a wash, and then I don't want it to pool, I just want it to transform the color underneath into a new color. Using multiple thin coats to darken the color is definitely a better idea than one thicker coat. because you lose your transition and the smoothness of the blend. I'm going to go ahead and do one more glaze and make sure I'm not pooling. I think this will finish it off for the effect I'm looking for. So right now I'm getting the colors I want. However, I'm not quite getting the high reflective contrast I want out of the tips of the ice and the edges of it. So I'm actually going to go back and return with my Mara White just to quickly highlight the edges. Just remember to make sure your coats are thin and that you don't put too much on your brush so you can maintain control over how much you're applying. Depending on the type of ice you're trying to go for, how thick it is, and how reflective you want it, you can always go deeper with another shade in the same way you applied the Meridius blue. But for this particular effect, I just want a frosting and newly formed cold ice that might be ready to melt soon, so I don't want it to be too dark. I'm going to add a little bit more Mara White to make sure it increases the contrast where it meets the blade. So I'm really happy with the way it looks. I just need to do some cleanup. I could stop here, but I'm going to do one more step just to kick it up a notch. Now I'm going to quickly base coat this axe head with pig iron because the next step will require a fully painted blade. So now that I've finished the base coat of the pig iron, I'm going to go ahead and gradiate out another layer of frost over top of the blade to make it look like the cold of the ice here is actually frosting the blade itself. So I'm going to create another glaze in my wet palette. This time I'm going to use a darker color, and I'm going to go with Signar Blue Highlight. So I'm going to get a little bit of paint. I'm going to water it down a lot. Creating glazes, you just got to get used to it. You got to find your comfort zone, the paint consistency, how much control you can have over it, and making sure that it's very watered down. So I'm going to apply this blue just like I did with the Meridius blue, but this time I'm going to bring it up onto the blade and slowly build up layers to make it look like it's frosting on top. We still want to make sure it doesn't pool, and we're okay with going for multiple layers and multiple coats. So I'm going to keep applying coats until I get to the depth of the shade I'm looking for. Personally, I'm not a very patient painter, but it really pays off to just slow down and make sure you're doing everything to give you a result you end up happy with. So at this point, I'm happy with the contrast I'm actually getting on the ice itself. So I just want to keep using this glaze that I created to build up layers on the blade until I'm happy with it. And then this is just up to personal choice of how blue you want it to be, or if you even want it to be blue at all. So it's important to make sure that your previous layer of glaze is completely dry before you move on to your next layer. Otherwise, you might leave a ring as you push apart half-dried, half-wet paint. So here I'm happy with the overall effect of the ice and frost. I'm very happy that I decided to pull up some of the blue onto the blade itself to create a nice chill effect. You're welcome to go darker with the blade, adding more layers of the previous glaze, or not apply any at all. That choice is up to you. Now we're ready to keep our enemies on ice. Join me next time as we go over arcane and glow effects to bring some magic to the tabletop. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more videos. And check out the links below for more in this series and additional information on the P3 hobby line.
Are you a hand talker, Brendan?
Absolutely not.